Good evening, everybody who's with us. Glad to have you here this evening. I think most of you know who I am. I'm Zach, and got my friend Whitney here, and some of you probably know her, but most of you probably don't yet until tonight. If you were with us back with me in the business back in COVID, you might recognize Whitney from we did some when everything got shut down and everything that could be done online was done online. I did some webinars back then, and we did a little brain health series back then. And that was before, Whitney, that was before you had developed the brain technique. You were already well on your path and your expertise and working with folks, but this technique is something that you've been developing in the time since then, right?
It has, yes.
Yeah. I'm not gonna speak for long. I'll just do a little bit more introduction of Whitney. I doubt Whitney remembers it because I wouldn't expect her to remember my face among the many students that she taught. But back in 2004, when I was in massage school, she was taught the intro to Chinese medicine, which was a handful of classes. So she was the first person to ever put a acupuncture needle. If I remember, it went somewhere in here, my right ear, right up here. I did my first acupuncturist, I guess, in that group setting. But we didn't stay in touch after that. But some years later, we reconnected, and now for over a decade, we've been in touch with each other, and it's been fun and interesting and fascinating for me as her friend to be on the outside looking in a bit with her journey into this world of brain health. And tonight we're going to be hearing about her B.R.A.I.N.S technique, which is something she can tell us the timeline on when she really got going with it, maybe named it as such, but it's been a work in progress for some years, and it's something I've experienced the benefits of. And I've got a handful of clients that are friends or have been students or clients of Whitney as well, and they've shared with me some of their stories. One of them's on the call with us tonight, and we'll have Tina share a little bit of her story when at some point. We don't have that exactly scheduled in, but it'll happen at some point. So excited for you all to be here. This is being recorded. What we're going to ask people to do, so Whitney's going to talk for a little bit. At any point, if you have a question, if you'll just put it in the chat box, I'll be in charge of helping get those in front of Whitney for her to respond to. With that being said, I'm going to turn it over to you, Whitney, to tell us a little bit about who you are and your background and how you developed the B.R.A.I.N.S technique, and then tell us more about that.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you all for joining this evening. I wanted to thank Zach for allowing me to share this with you. And I'm just really super excited to be here with you all. My background is I've been an acupuncturist for 25 years here in North Carolina. And I am also a certified brain health professional and trainer by the B.R.A.I.N Clinic. And we're actually going to get to look at a scan this evening, a SPECT scan, to show you the impact of stress and trauma on the brain, which is why we are all here. When there is anxiety or stress or trauma, the B.R.A.I.N.S technique can help you very quickly to be able to not only regulate your nervous system and bring you out of a fight or flight state, but it can also help you to find a resolution, a solution to the trauma or stressor. And that's what makes it really different than other self-regulating or somatic tools that just help to calm your nervous system, which is fantastic. We definitely need to do that. But the other piece, the gem of the B.R.A.I.N.S technique, is that it helps you to find a solution to the stressor. So we'll talk about that. A little bit about my backstory is my daughter, when she was 5 years old, her dad died and she had post-traumatic stress. And I knew she did. And I took her to therapy and I took her to all sorts of different types of modalities. Being an acupuncturist, I'm very holistic in nature, and I had a lot of access to a lot of different practitioners. From the age of 5 until the age of 17, things would help a little bit, but not much. Her main symptom of having stress in her brain was that she didn't have any short-term memory. So her brain, in its beautiful desire to protect her, had decided that anything that happens in the present moment is not to be remembered, because when her dad died, it was too painful. The brain was doing its job, which was to protect her, but it made for school and for learning anything and for friends and everything else to be really difficult. I found the B.R.A.I.N Clinic, Dr. Daniel Amen, who is a Western trained psychiatrist, and he has 11 centers in the United States now. He developed a way to look at the brain to see how stress and trauma actually react in the brain. I brought Haley down to the Atlanta office at the B.R.A.I.N clinic, and we got a SPECT scan, and I was able to see the mass impact of how her brain operates, because when there is post-traumatic stress disorder in the brain, it actually shifts the way that you have capability of accessing different parts of your brain. So it will change the quality of your life. And when I was able to see that, and we were able to get help for her post-traumatic stress disorder, she went from failing as a sophomore. She got a 17% on her PSATs. And a year later, 2 weeks after I took her to the B.R.A.I.N clinic and under treatment, she actually got a 76%. So she came into her junior year in high school failing, and she ended up with a 4.0 the last 2 years. Her brain was on, and she was able to learn, and she was able to take everything in and have a short-term memory again. That is where my brain training comes from. And I was like, who is this Dr. Daniel Amen, and why haven't I heard of him before? This was back in 2017. And that's when I started studying him and became one of his certified practitioners. So the other thing that I practice is German New Medicine. Chinese medicine, German New Medicine, and neuroscience are all intermingled in the brain's technique. There was a evening 2 years ago that I was at home and received traumatic news about a dear friend of mine that had committed suicide. And I live in a very rural area, and the closest person to me was a couple miles away. I knew that I had to tend to this news in my system. Otherwise, I knew that I was going to get sick because it was such traumatic news. I pulled in 25 years of my experience, of my practitioner training, of working with clients, and just pulled everything in, and out came what has now become the B.R.A.I.N.S technique. And within 5 to 7 minutes after I was hysterical and crying and screaming and at the top of my lungs up here on the top of the mountain, within 7 minutes, I was calmed down. And not only was I calmed down, but I literally felt my brain turn back on. And I was able to tend to all of the details in order to support my dear friend whose wife was left behind. That is what has become the B.R.A.I.N.S technique. I was in process of putting training programs together, which I have just finished now, but I was in process back September of this year, and Hurricane Helene came ripping through the region. And I put my programs aside, and I just stopped everything, and I started volunteering. I was treating first responders, survivors, and volunteers with the B.R.A.I.N.S technique of anybody who had any type of experience from the hurricane. I did that for 4 months, and then that brought me to January. And then in January, people here started referring me out to the Los Angeles fires in January. And so I started treating acute stress from the LA fires. I've used it in natural disasters. I've used it in daily life with people. There's not many times that I walk outside the door that I don't use it with somebody, whether it be a neighbor or somebody crying in the parking lot who's hysterical at the Ingles grocery store. That's happened to me before. I use it all the time. And you can use it for yourself, and you can use it to treat others as well, to work with others. If you're a community advocate or a parent or a teacher or a caregiver. And you can also use it on your pets, on your furry ones. They actually respond as well. My dog and I had been attacked by a couple dogs, and I used it on him and I used it on me, and we did not have any post-traumatic stress from that event. And it was very scary. It was a very scary event. There's just a lot of ways that it can be used, and you'll hear some stories tonight as well. The B.R.A.I.N.S technique is based on utilizing bilateral stimulation, which means that we are using both parts of the body, because when you were tapping on the thighs or on the upper arms, but it's different than the butterfly hug. It's different than EMDR. It's different than EFT because it's a very specific process in terms of time and tempo and focus throughout the 5 to 7 minutes of the B.R.A.I.N.S technique. With the bilateral stimulation, what I want to show you is I do not have SPECT scans on the B.R.A.I.N.S technique yet, but that is hopeful to come soon when I'm going to be doing some research. But I want to show you the power of how and why bilateral stimulation shifts the brain. And one thing to know is when we use the B.R.A.I.N.S technique, you want to use it during or within minutes, hours, days, or weeks of the stress event. And again, it doesn't have to be natural disaster kind of event. It could be an argument with a coworker or a partner or a child or something like that that's just very upsetting. You know that you are stressed if you are constantly thinking over and over again about a particular event, or you're waking up in the middle of the night and you're thinking about it again and you're processing it. That's when you know that something is triggered in your brain, and that's when you want to use the B.R.A.I.N.S technique. We want to get to the point that when we become stressed, for me, I know that I'm stressed because I can feel a cortisol release in my body and I start getting shaky. And I'm like, oh, my brain just registered something as dangerous. And so I've got to get my brain back online to then be able to find a solution. I'm going to show you the power of bilateral stimulation and a SPECT scan. We're going to geek out for a minute here with the brain scan. A SPECT scan actually takes a picture of the brain with showing blood flow in the areas where it's flowing beautifully and where it's stuck, where there's hyperactivity and then when there's hypoactivity. There's either too much blood in an area or it's running beautifully, or there's too little blood running in an area. When somebody has post-traumatic stress, this is what a brain can look like. When you're looking at this particular brain, we're taking a look at it from the chin underneath, taking a picture from underneath the brain. Up here is your prefrontal cortex, is the front of your brain, and back here is the back of your brain, also known as the cerebellum. This brain is a first responder brain that has PTSD. The blue area means that the blood flow in those areas are flowing beautifully. There are certain regions in the brain that do certain activities, and for the areas that are blue, that their brain is working. It's working good in those areas. However, in the areas where there's a lot of red, that means that there's too much blood flow in certain areas that get stuck. Here, this is the beginning of what's called the cingulate gyrus, and this is our gear shifter in our brain. This is the center line of the brain, and this here means that there's too much blood flow on the center line. That is our gear shifter. That is our capacity to adapt and change gears with whatever we're doing. For example, I can be talking to you, somebody can come into the room, I can speak to them, and I can come back, and I can know exactly where I am, and I can continue talking. If you've had a child where you have said, okay, dinner is in 5 minutes, okay, dinner's in 2 minutes, okay, we're sitting down for dinner, and they're still over there playing with their toy, it is because their cingulate gyrus is actually, for them, it is not fully developed. The brain develops from the rear, from the cerebellum, all the way to the prefrontal cortex. The cingulate gyrus is in the middle of that. And when a child is paying attention to what they're playing, they don't hear you. They don't know what's going on in the rest of the house. They are paying attention to their toy. With the cingulate gyrus, this can be a person that can get very stubborn about something. They can be very argumentative. They can hold grudges. They can have opposition. You can say yes, and they will say no. You can say blue, and they will say red, just to be oppositional. When blood flow is stuck in that part of their brain, that means that their cingulate gyrus has too much blood flow there. This also shows the basal ganglia, which is anxiety and the panic area of the brain. This sets the idle for the brain and for your system. If you tend to be an anxious person or you tend to be conflict avoidant, anxiety or you're an overworker, this area, when this has too much blood flow, is showing that this area is stuck. And this person will, because they have more of an anxious personality, they will do anything under the sun to avoid conflict. Anything. They will say, yes, ma'am. They will say, yes, sir. They will agree with you, even though they don't agree with you. They just do not want an argument or confrontation. Another area here that is hyperactive with the blood flow is the deep limbic system. And this is where our emotions really stem from, a lot of the emotions. If we have too much here, that person will be irritable or depressed. They'll have very negative thinking. They'll have decreased motivation. They may tend to socially isolate. And they can either have a super high libido or a super low, but it usually is not neutral. And then here in the bottom is the cerebellum. We think of the cerebellum physically and keeping our balance, and that is true. But it also is our emotional mental balance. The cerebellum is actually the CPU unit. It's the central processing unit for the entire brain. Every thought, every feeling, every chemical that goes through the brain also goes through the cerebellum. We want to have some activity back here. Actually, we do want a little bit of red, but this is way too much red. This means there's too much blood flow there. And what happens when that happens is that person will be startled very easily. If somebody has post-traumatic stress and they tend to be jumpy, then typically there's too much blood flow in the cerebellum area. The reason I am showing you this is because I want you to see the power of what bilateral stimulation does in a brain. With EMDR, which is called eye movement desensitization reprocessing, it is a therapy that therapists use for post-traumatic stress disorder. And with eye movement desensitization reprocessing, with that modality, you can do it with your eyes, or you can do it with bilateral tapping as well when you do alternate tapping on the body. But it's done differently for different lengths of time and different focus. And it's for specifically post-traumatic stress disorder. The B.R.A.I.N.S technique is for the acute stress disorder. It's anything that has happened in the last 4 months. The sooner that we get to reprocess it in our brain, then a couple things are going to happen. You're going to prevent post-traumatic stress in your brain. You're going to prevent illness, or you're going to have just a really quick illness instead of a longer one. It would be like the difference of if you were to have a car accident and your brain registered as traumatic. Some people can walk away and have a car accident and be like, yeah, no big deal, I survived. That's great. Other people walk away and they're traumatized and they can't get in the car and don't want to drive again. And so if your brain registers something like that as traumatic and you're thinking about it, the longer that you keep thinking about it, the more that your blood flow is going to get stuck in different areas of your brain. When you finally resolve it, you may end up with a cold for a day or two, for example, or a skin rash, or some sort of immune response will happen. If you wait until after the 4 months and you're in post-traumatic stress and say 10 years later you go to therapy, it could be more like bronchitis or pneumonia instead of a 2-day colds. The sooner that you take care of and downgrade the acute stress that you experience on a regular basis, the less physical illnesses that you will have. This strengthens your immune system. This is before EMDR, so this has too much blood flow going on. This is during an EMDR session. So this is what happens once you are doing the bilateral stimulation for a while. You're reprocessing the memory, and that's true of the B.R.A.I.N.S technique as well. You're actually neutralizing it, and it gives you different perspective. If you had a car accident and say it was a red car that hit you, and every time that you see a red car, your heart starts beating fastly, you start sweating, and you start having a foggy brain, then you're still being triggered by that trauma. And so when you process it through bilateral stimulation in a very specific way, then when a red car goes by, you're like, oh yeah, I remember that car accident was terrible. but you don't have the physical reaction to it, which it puts it off into the distance instead of viscerally in your body every time that you see a red car. And you develop new tactics. At this point, you are building resiliency for the next time you have a stressor. So the trauma gets actually reformatted. And this is what happens after bilateral stimulation. They no longer have post-traumatic stress in their brain. Just to show you, just a reminder. So this is blood flow is stuck in certain areas, hyperactive in certain areas. And this is a way more balanced brain. This person now has cognitive flexibility. They can shift, they can adapt, they're no longer oppositional, they can see options, they can see possibilities. I don't know if you've ever run into somebody who has just walked out of a car accident and there are no options. The only thing that they're doing is they're running like hell for survival. And there are no options except to survive. And you're not thinking about being able to make dinner or work on a creative project or do anything except to survive. This person also now has enhanced motivation and they are no longer stuck in anxiety. They can actually experience pleasure. And the deep limbic system, now they can bond, they can connect. They're not going to be socially isolated and they're going to be able to process smells better. Their libido is now going to be more in a central line versus super high or super low. They will also, down here, they will also have a normal startle response. That is what happens with bilateral stimulation. I just wanted to show you that because it's a very powerful image of being able to see what's happening when you use the B.R.A.I.N.S technique. So you can use it for, there's 13 different ways to apply the B.R.A.I.N.S technique. You can use it for stress and anxiety. You can use it in the middle of the night. It's super quiet. You can use it if you're fearful you won't fall asleep. You can use it before you go to sleep. If you're going into a tense conversation with a partner or a coworker, you can do it beforehand. You can get your blood flow all in the prefrontal cortex, and you will have much better access in order to communicate what you're needing and to be able to listen to somebody else. When somebody else is really riled up about something, they typically can't hear anybody but themselves. This is a really good communication tool and relationship tool as well that you can use the B.R.A.I.N.S technique for. There's so many different examples. I worked with somebody today who had a very difficult work situation and they kept thinking about it over and over again. When we did the technique, they were able to not only calm their reaction when they heard the person's name, but they were also able to figure out what they needed to do to complete the conversation and to be able to move forward. Here's the thing. Your brain is, it's actually your, what we call is your psyche. Your psyche consists of your subconscious brain, your conscious brain, and even your parents' belief systems, because your parents' belief systems become your belief systems. And the psyche includes all of that. And it is your psyche that registers danger. That's the part of the human being that we have this amazing safety net that if something is dangerous, it is going to actually take a 360-degree snapshot of everything that's happening around us, utilizing all 5 of our senses. When that happens, later on, if that snapshot is not downgraded within the first 4 months, then that's what becomes post-traumatic stress. And there can be triggers from that scene of that picture that was taken. For example, going back to the car accident, if somebody was in a car accident with a red car, and every time they see a red car, their heart starts racing. And we can actually, with the B.R.A.I.N.S technique, if it was beyond 4 months, we could actually work with just that one trigger of the red car. We would not go back to the entire traumatic situation because I'm not a therapist. The B.R.A.I.N.S technique is for specifically acute stress and for triggers from post-traumatic stress, but you can work with that with a B.R.A.I.N.S technique practitioner.
I do have a question here from Joe, it says, what if your traumatic memories are repressed due to dissociation?
The brain's technique can work with things that you have a visceral response with. If you don't know what it is, it's hard to be able to work exactly with that to rewire it. Because what we're doing is we're rewiring the stressor or trauma in the brain as it is no longer a danger or a threat. If it's repressed, that is difficult to work with. Yeah.
And then Mary asks, have you used this with pre-adolescents that have high functioning autism?
Yes, it depends on their sensitivities. Typically, with autism, the parent or caregiver is going to be doing the tapping for them because it can be distracting for them to focus on something and tap. I have used it with success unless they are very sensitive to touch. That can be challenging. You can also use the bilateral tapping on your thighs. You can also do it on your arms, and you can also move your feet up and down, but the feet doesn't have quite as big of an imprint on the brain as the thigh does. The thigh has a larger imprint, so there's more blood flow. What happens with bilateral tapping is when you tap on your right thigh using your whole hand, then blood flow will increase to your left side and vice versa. And so you're getting blood flow moving everywhere in your brain, and then you've got access everywhere.
This is a question from me. If I understand correctly here because with the images you talked a lot about here is areas of excessive blood flow, but that would reciprocally mean that these other areas have lack of blood flow relatively. So now you're talking about with the bilateral tapping, we're getting more of a balanced blood flow everywhere. So we don't have it hyper concentrated here and there,
Yes.
and then under circulating in other areas. Is that accurate?
Yes. Once the blood flow increases everywhere, you will now have equal access to all parts of your brain. Unless there was a physical concussion or traumatic brain injury or something like that that changed the structure of a specific area of the brain, as long as it hasn't been physically changed, you will have access to all areas of your brain.
Okay, great. Thank you. I didn't say it's the top of the call, so say it now. We are going to have a chance, right, to do a little practice
Yeah.
ourselves with you, led by you here in a few minutes. Okay, great. Tina's on the call. Now might be a good time for her to
Okay.
share with us. Tina, I'll let you share what you'd like to about your experience with the brain's technique.
Thank you, Zach. I have had the fortune of being a client of Whitney's and a friend and a very close friend, sister, and at times her guinea pig as she was working out the technique. I'd like to share that my husband and I are going through a lot of trauma right now. He has neurodegenerative disease and he's failing. And last week he fell and hurt himself in a public place. So I stopped breathing as all this was happening. And a friend of mine who I introduced Whitney to was with me. And she said, get in that car and we're going to start tapping right now. And it was my lifesaver because I was able to calm myself down, calm my brain down, start breathing, and be able to speak to the ER docs and make sure that my husband was okay. I reported this to Whitney and she said, okay, we're going to do this again with you because I hear your voice is tight. And I did it and it shifted everything for me. I was able to not have that startled response and be very irritable, be upset with him so that I could go back to being his primary caregiver when we got him home on Saturday. Then Whitney worked with my husband. I tapped for him because he can't use both his hands, and I tapped and she talked with him. And in 5.5 minutes, he downgraded what was a very scary experience for him. He was scared. He wasn't sure what happened to him as he fell in the bathroom and split his head open. And then he was beating himself up. And his whole mood changed. He was pleasant to be around. this works for anything. I've used it when I've had calls with my sister, who drives me crazy, who I love, but she drives me crazy. And I use it all the time. It is much better than any kind of drug, Ativan, or any anxiety drug there is out there. And it's even better than an aspirin. So I can't urge you enough to learn about this and learn from the person who developed this, because it's brilliant. And it's a great tool to have in your bag, and you get to pull from it first. I use it a lot as my husband's primary caregiver, because on any given day, as any of your partner can drive you nuts. And with a debilitating illness, there's a lot going on. So I just want to thank Whitney for being there for us, and Zach for giving me this opportunity to share with you that it really does work.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tina. I'll share briefly. Another friend of Whitney's, who coincidentally knows, she's the mother, my daughter's best friend. She's her mother. So we're parents. It's just a coincidence that we both know Whitney. But I ran into her on the 4th of July, downtown fireworks, and she recently hurt her knees, had a knee surgery, and she's been in a lot of pain. She's a physical therapist. Like, she works with people coming post-operative, and she's been doing it for 30 years. And so she knows all about this stuff, but now it's happening to her. She's in more pain than what she expected. And I just ran into her the 4th of July, and we started chatting. How are you doing? She's telling me how bad the pain's been. And she was telling me about the day before, I think, when it was like, she said it was like a 13 out of 10. And she did the B.R.A.I.N.S technique, and she said the pain in her knee came down to about a 3 or 4, something that was much more manageable. So I think it's worth noting on this call too, Whitney, if you want to speak more to this, that can also help physical pain, and maybe you can tell us why that is, interplay between emotional and physical pain and so on, but how this can also be helpful for physical pain as well as psycho-emotional stressors.
Yeah, absolutely. What happens when we physically injure ourselves? The brain does not know the difference between physical pain, emotional pain, or mental pain. It is just pain. It is in the pain loop in the brain. It is pain. When we have physical injury and it's been there for a day or two, we're like, oh yeah, that's a drag. And we kind of keep moving unless it completely stops us. And then over the days and weeks, then it's not only the physical injury, but then it's how we feel about having the pain, because pain could be such a drain on our system. And so now we have the physical injury, and now we have a lot of emotion about it. Now the pain loop in the brain is quite high. One thing that I have seen over and over again is that when we do a B.R.A.I.N.S technique on that pain, we can actually not only take care of the mental emotional part of the pain, but we can also help reduce the physical pain as well. I had a client who has had cancer 5 different times, and she is on chemo for the rest of her life. She has a bad hip that the surgeons say she needs surgery, but nobody will touch her because she's on the chemotherapy. And so she has to live with this hip that is no longer functioning. She was getting, as you can imagine, just physical pain was up there, and then the emotional mental pain was just starting to be off the charts. We did a B.R.A.I.N.S technique session, and this woman is tough as nails, and she has been through the ringer. And I asked her on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the most intense, what level of intensity is the hip pain? And she immediately said 212 out of 10. And I was like, okay, I know this is super intense for this woman. We worked through the B.R.A.I.N.S technique, and within about 9 or 10 minutes, we got it down to about a 5, which I was thrilled with, and she was thrilled with. I said, I want you to get up and I want you to start moving around. And she's like, it's a 5. She's, I can manage this. This is no problem. She was able to come off of her pain meds because she didn't want to be on pain meds and be loopy and have the chemotherapy in her system and just not feel like a human being. And so she got off her pain meds, and we're going on 9 months now that we did this technique specifically on the hip. And She says sometimes it ranges from a 0 to 5. She said it's no big deal. She said she can go to sleep now. Before, she couldn't get comfortable in her bed. And she said, when it flares up, I just rest. She said, I'm not using my walker and I'm not using a cane. Here's the thing. She needs surgery. Like, she needs help for that joint. The emotional and mental pain was just taking her over the edge of being able to handle the pain. That's one example. And Zach was speaking about our mutual friend, Eileen. It has really helped with her healing process, because we cannot heal if we feel like we're running from a tiger. If our pain level's so high, we cannot heal during that time. Think about it. If we're running from a tiger, is our body going to put resources into taking care of a wound or digesting or anything else that's not necessary in relation to having to survive that millisecond? We have to come out of that fight, flight, survival mode in order for our bodies to heal. That's another way it can be used. I do want to just touch on again, just to make sure to understand, EMDR is a therapy that I highly recommend to use with professionally trained therapists. That is, the organization is emdria.org. That is your go-to if you have post-traumatic stress disorder. If you have anything that's happened in the last 4 months, then that's when you want to use the B.R.A.I.N.S technique. So it's very clearly different. You need a therapist for somebody to take you back into a traumatic situation. And if you are feeling what you are feeling for something that's happened in the last 4 months, you can do it yourself, or a certified B.R.A.I.N.S technique practitioner can bring you through the process as well. Also have done some preliminary research on HRV, which is the heart rate variability. That tells us what happens between the heartbeats in the heart, and it tells us our resiliency. For example, athletes will use their HRV to determine how hard they should push that day. Did they get enough sleep? Did they eat well? Did they repair enough from the workout the day before? And that will tell you how hard to push for the next workout. So with the HRV, the higher the HRV, the more resilience you have. And so far, just in some preliminary tests, I have seen anywhere from HRV jump 20 to 60 points in just that 5 to 7 minutes of doing a B.R.A.I.N.S technique session, which is really fantastic. It helps to build your resiliency and your immune system.
I think there's a lot of fitness technology, watches, Apple Watches and Garmin's. They'll give you like a stress score at the end of your day. It'll tell you had a stressful day or not so stressful day and so on. And as I understand it, that's typically an algorithm they have that's based on your kind of calculating your heart rate variability throughout the day. And heart rate variability, just, we don't need to go into a deep dive on it, but it's just, as I understand, it has to do with the pattern, basically the beating pattern of your heart. And there's a certain amount of regularity and irregularity that indicates how stressed out or not, or how well functioning, how balanced your system is. And it's been correlated to the function of all sorts of things, the immune system, endocrine system, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of science behind HR. So for Whitney to say you're seeing, that's really exciting to me to hear that you're already seeing some really exciting results in HRV changes with the B.R.A.I.N.S technique.
Yeah. Yeah.
You want to tell us real quick? It's an acronym. You want to tell us what the acronym stands for?
Sure. B.R.A.I.N.S stands for bilateral, because we're using two sides of the body. And the R is resolution, because we want to find a resolution to the stressor or trauma. This is not about just regulating the nervous system and calming down. It is about finding a resolution. That's what makes the difference between this and EFT and EMDR and other techniques that are out there. It's bilateral resolution that we use during the acute interrupted nervous system. So A.I.N.S, acute interrupted nervous system. We use B.R.A.I.N.S when things have happened within the last 4 months. This can be a little challenging for a group because everybody processes at a different rate. I'll try to check in with everybody. If anybody who is off screen that wants to do the technique, I do need to see your face so that I can keep an eye on you, make sure that you're doing okay, and also to be able to know when to guide you into the next phase. Thank you. What we want to do is we want to focus on what's called a snapshot. I want you to think about something that was stressful in the last 4 months. Has to be within the last 4 months, ideally the last minutes, hours, days, couple weeks. think about what that is. And I want you to come up with maybe 2 sentences in your mind of what that was. For example, if I was in the car accident, there's a lot of things that happen in a car accident and after. It depends what your brain says, okay, this was the most stressful part of the entire car accident. You want to find the needle in the haystack. You want to find the millisecond, the minutes where that something was stressful for you. If it was a car accident, for example, and I'll use the example with the red car, and now the red car is a big flash for me, my 2 sentences might be, I was hit from behind and I went flying through the windshield and I landed on the ground and I was terrified. There's a lot of things that happen in a car accident. You want to get as specific as possible of what your stressor was. Instead of thinking like, oh, I had a stressful conversation with my coworker, the 2 or 3 sentences would be, my coworker used this tone of voice that sent me over the edge. And they said, blah, blah, blah. They said, I am not doing it right and you're going to get fired. And I started feeling shaky and my adrenaline started running. And that would be a 2 or 3 sentence snapshot. Does everybody have an idea of what they want to work on? What I'm going to have you guys do is to go ahead and put your right hand on your right thigh and your left hand on your left thigh. And I want you to think about the real estate in your hand. I want you, when you're tapping on your thigh, I want you to use your whole hand, because the more contact that you make for your hand, the more blood flow that's going to hit in the opposite hemisphere. I don't want you to tap like this. I want you to tap like that, whole hand. And you don't have to come up like this. You can just do a couple inches above. I'm going to tell you what the pacing is and what to focus on. And if anybody is having distress, I will keep an eye on the chat, and you can text me personally, and I'll help you get through whatever stumbling block you have. Okay, so I'm going to have everybody take a deep breath, and you can start tapping. You're going to go right, left, right, left, right, left, right, left, right, left, right, left, right, left. You're going to go at that pace. It's got to be fast right now. We'll slow down later. I want you to think about that snapshot. I want you to think about that 2 to 3 sentence thing of whatever happened. And I want you to feel the most distressing thing about that particular event. I want you to think about what your senses were, what were the sights, the sounds, the smells. And I want you to also think about what could be the worst case scenario from that particular event. What is your greatest fear that may or may not have come true? And allow yourself to think about the worst possible scenario with that event, because your brain has already gone there. So we're just going to bring it up forward. This is the hardest part of the technique. It can be very uncomfortable. That's why it's challenging to do with a group. But I am here, and I promise if you stick with me, I will get you to the other side for relief. Think about that snapshot, and I'm going to be quiet for 2.5 minutes. And keep tapping quickly, and I will check back in with you. It's a little challenging to do with the group because everybody's on a different processing time. What I would invite you to do now that you have finished is any new thoughts or perspectives that have come up, especially in those last 2.5 minutes while you were slow tapping. Typically, new thoughts, new perspectives will come in during that time of things that you can do, or you'll look at the situation, or you'll start to have compassion and empathy for the other person involved. When we get blood flow here to our prefrontal cortex, that actually turns on our compassion and empathy. When we are running from a tiger, we don't really care about anybody else at that point. I would invite you, when we get off the call, to write down any new thoughts or perspectives. And over the next 24 hours, and this is really important, over the next 24 hours, I want you to look for validation of your new perspective. You may be driving down the road and see something on the billboard, or a song comes on the radio, or somebody says something to you, or somebody recommends a podcast or whatever. And all of a sudden you're like, oh, that's what came yesterday when I was doing that slow tapping. I want you to look for validation of your new thoughts and perspectives. And you may have continued new thoughts and perspectives about the situation. Your brain is on full power now. You have access to all areas of your brain and nooks and crannies that you may not have seen for a while, that may have been in the dark for a little while. This is the part of the technique that typically, if you do it with a practitioner, you will receive a follow-up call the next day to actually stop and to think about, oh, what has been the validation? What is my new perspective? Because you want to close the brain loop of everything that we just rewired. When you go to sleep tonight, when your brain gets a nice wash and cleansing and the short-term memory moves into long-term memory, this new way of looking at this event is going to get moved into long-term memory. So it's going to be there of the new perspective that you have about the situation.
How much should it be like an active, like we're trying to create new perspectives,
You
as
don't have to
opposed to
try.
like we're just trying to be available to it without trying to make it. So
Give
like
them-
create an affirmation around it. We just kind of wait for whatever comes up to come.
Great point. Thank you. Yeah, this is not about putting a smiley face on an empty gas tank. That's not what this is about. This is about your brain now having full capacity and you seeing new things. You know, when you go travel and you haven't been to somewhere, even if you're just in the airport, and all of a sudden things are brighter and you're looking at people and you're seeing the way that they walk and expressions and you're paying attention in a new way. That's what happens when you have your brain fully back on. All of a sudden you're like, I've passed this billboard a bazillion times in the past years and I've never seen it before. And all of a sudden it jumps out at you. What does it say? Is it validating your new perspective? Or is it giving you another new perspective? This is not about creating a new affirmation or forcing something. That is really important. It is your psyche that registered the threat, and it is your psyche that has to come up with the solution. I can sit here all day long and throw out different ideas and thoughts, and it is your psyche that has to come up with that solution. It's going to be different for everybody. Anybody want to share about their experience?
I'll share my experience to open it up for other people. It can be a little bit of a challenge for me. Is I can be pretty tuned in and to, okay, this thing happened, and I'll start with the present thing, right? And I've got my statement, I'm doing the tapping, but it doesn't take my brain long to make some association to like the deeper pattern here, right? This is tied into this much thing that is maybe a lifelong or many years pattern, right? It's just this was a moment where that got triggered, and so that was happening. I associated, okay, this happened. My brain went deeper into the rabbit hole with some of the history behind it, and was hanging around in that space for a while. And I was like, okay, I don't think that's probably helpful because it's past, that was more than 4 months ago. So just having to bring myself back to what was I feeling in that moment? What was I feeling in that moment? What am I feeling now? And just like reel in my tendency to stay in this place that goes back further than the 4 months. In the end, it was a success. It took a little while. I feel like I stalled out or whatever in like that space for a little bit. I imagine you encounter this with people frequently. So if you want to speak to that, and also just add that my experience this time was one where the primary emotion started out as anger, and it went up and and I think you told us this might happen, like it escalated and it got pretty increasingly uncomfortable in my body. And then I just keep going with that. And then when it came down, I was like, okay, it's below 3. What am I feeling now? It wasn't really anger. It shifted, but it was sadness. And I would put the sadness under a 3, but like palpable. So there was a shift there to a different quality of emotion when it comes to the labels of it. So I share that to let people know that maybe that's going to be part of the experience too. Maybe you're calmer, hopefully. That's certainly I did. I would say it's under a 3, but it's like instead of, I don't really feel any of the anger that I did now. That got really high at one point during the tapping, and it's come way down, but that's gone now. It's a different emotion. It's sadness. It's down around a 3, we'll say.
Thank you so much for sharing that experience. So over the next 24, 48 hours, that could continue to decrease, especially as you look for validation of your new perspective about it. Typically, when we go into big feeling emotions, a lot of times there is either fear or sadness that's underneath it. And it might be sadness about something in the past. Our brain is a web of information and memories. And so something happens, and boy, that takes us back to when we were a kid or when we were a teenager, or a coworker said something, and it is amazing what the web is in our brain. That's why when you're processing, and it's really important to do the processing silently to yourself, because if you took time to actually speak the words while it was happening, you would lose the capacity to process as quickly. You want to be able to process it quietly in your brain. Like Zach said, sometimes it can go up. You may start at an 8 or 9, and it can go up to like a 15, and then it'll come back down, because it's like you've had a lid on it and you're like holding it down. And then when you finally rip the lid off and you're like, oh my God, I am really angry. And then you just skyrocket. And then as you're doing it, as the blood flow is starting to get into your brain, you're starting to calm down. It's rewiring it in your brain. So it's no longer in that visceral field, but it's off into the distance. Anybody else have anything they want to share about their experience, or questions, or something that happened? Or yeah, please, Mary.
Mine was a more of an event that happened recent in 4th of July. It was just an event that happened, and it was scary and it was sad. And it's not the first time I observed it, but so mine was a reaction to something somebody else was going through. Over time, I guess I'll use this again when I see it. What I got to is just being able to not see it and hear it. It was loud and aggressive. And so with doing this, I was able to lessen my intensity around the feelings of it.
Absolutely. That's so great. That's exactly how it works.
Okay.
It just puts it in the corner. It doesn't mean that it didn't happen. We don't live in a world anymore where we are being chased by tigers, not usually, but our psyche, our brain is wired to protect us from what we register as a dangerous situation. We feel like it's a tiger, but that's why we're rewiring it, because it's okay, that was bad, but it's not a tiger that's still chasing me, that I should still relive over and over and over again. I had a woman on another info session that I did last week who was in Israel. She raised her hand to volunteer. And I said, what is most stressful for you right now? And she said, I live 8 miles south of Lebanon and the bombs were going off. And she said, it's the sirens that actually were triggering for her, not the bombs, not the sounds of everything else, but the sirens. We did the session, and she said, it's when you hear a siren, you have 15 seconds to get to safety. And while she was doing the slow tapping, a police siren came through in her village, and she heard the siren, but she didn't have any reaction to it. She was like, no, I'm okay. And so here's the thing. We want the body to react when the sirens go off, right? We want to make her brain will be like, we got to go get safety. We got to go to safety. You still want to have that reaction, but you don't want to panic about it. You want to have your full brain capacity. You want to think about, okay, you got 15 seconds. Where's my daughter? Is the stove on? Do I need to grab anything else before I go into the shelter? That's what you want to be thinking about. And so that's what we shifted her brain pattern to be able to do that. And she's been much better. So it can be used in all sorts of situations.
Generally speaking, particularly when you've had some practice with it, like what do you find a lot of people, how much time it takes to do a session?
On average, 7 to 10 minutes. If the person has post-traumatic stress, if the person has a traumatic brain injury or concussion, it can take longer. And I find that typically men will process it quicker. They'll be more in the 5 to 7 range. Those are super big averages because everybody's just really different. I'm going to put my website here on the chat. I have 2 different programs. If you want to learn this for yourself and to use it for immediate family, but using it mostly for yourself, I have the Brains Technique Foundations program. And that is for anybody that can take it. You can binge it over a weekend. It's not too long, but it's explaining how it works and then also all the different ways, 13 different ways to apply it in your life. If you have a fear, if you have a belief that you want to change, if you have an event that was stressful, if you have anxiety, if you have insomnia, there's so many different ways to use it. You learn all of that, how and when to use it. And then if you are a practitioner of any kind, a caregiver, a parent, a teacher, a coach, a therapist, or a community advocate, I've got quite a few people who don't have any healing experience but they want to be able to, say, go down to Texas, for example, where the floods are, and they want to go down and they want to help those people. For those people, those community advocates that want to use it in that way, or the list that I just gave, the caregivers and practitioners, there's a program for the B.R.A.I.N.S Technique Certification Program. I have a live cohort that is starting this Friday, the 11th, and the next one will be in September. Those are the two programs that I have in order to learn how to use it. Zach had mentioned in the email, I was invited to speak on a panel for natural disasters, and they're looking for ingenuity to deal with the aftermath of a disaster. I'll be on a panel talking about the B.R.A.I.N.S technique in DC. Hopefully we can get some more research and spec scans done for the B.R.A.I.N.S technique, because I will tell you, being in this region of Western North Carolina, it was life-saving for hundreds and hundreds of people. Run into people all the time who I gave sessions to, and they'll say, "Oh my God, thank God I had that session, because my friend did not have a session with you and they are still traumatized. And every time it rains or every time the wind goes is a trigger, and they are still having issues from that event. And it has now moved into post-traumatic stress disorder." For anybody who is here, don't lose hope. It's not too far away. But if you were here during the hurricane or in a natural disaster, and for example, when you hear the wind howl, that's a trigger for you and your heart starts racing, then we can do a B.R.A.I.N.S technique session specifically on when you hear the wind howl. If the event was such a big deal and so many different things happened that were really triggering to you, then I would highly recommend to go to see an EMDR therapist who's trained in EMDR.
We had talked about there would be a way for folks. Normally, the price on the foundations program is $349,
Yes.
and we talked about giving $50 off for folks that are on this call.
I'll be sending out an email by tomorrow evening, and it will have a recording of this as well as the coupon code to use $50 towards either the B.R.A.I.N.S Technique Foundations program or the certification program. It is a thank you to Zach's VIP clients that have showed up. So thank you.
And the practitioner program, do you need to be a practitioner of something, or is you also wanting to learn at a deeper level to help other people, like friends, family? Do you need to have a certain training before you do the
You
practitioner?
don't need to be. You can be a caregiver, you can be a teacher, a parent, a community advocate. You could be a coach, you could be a therapist. Anybody who wants to really understand it to be able to work most effectively with others, you'd want to do the certification program. But here's the thing. Once you learn this skill, this is like writing. Once you learn the skill, you will use it for the rest of your life. There will be times I have been witness to a car accident, and I did it for a woman who I literally pulled out of the car. And once I assessed her physical, I brought her to the grass, and she was just shaking, and she was in total terror and adrenaline. Within, I think it was 8 minutes for her, and she was feeling it all. And we were able to use the entire snapshot and to completely mitigate post-traumatic stress for her. She got up after the session and she was like, "Oh, there was a car accident over there. I got to call the insurance company and my friend's going to be okay." It was just night and day versus like when I pulled her out and she was repeating 3 things. It was total night and day. There's a time to not use it, which is when somebody has a physical injury and the adrenaline is pumping and it's protecting that person from feeling that pain. So you don't want to use it then. And these are the kinds of things and scenarios that you learn about in the Foundations program, all the different ways to use it to be safe with it.
And if somebody wanted to work with you or another practitioner of the technique that's learned it, how would they go about that?
Yeah, great. On my website, you can go to consult and you can jump on my schedule for a one-on-one, or there's a practitioner page and you can work with certified practitioners on that practitioner page.
All right.
There's
And you
lots
say
of access.
the foundations program, but that you get, it's a self-paced course, if I understand correctly, and then you get also a month of calls that they can join with you, because a few times a month you do live calls like this where you support people and deepen in the process.
Thank you. So the foundations course is self-paced. You can binge it in a weekend if you want to. You can really get into it, or you can take a couple weeks to do it if you want. For the first month, it is free 2 live calls with me in a group setting. We will practice identifying your snapshot, which is really crucial because that is what we are rewiring. It's really crucial to be able to get the right snapshot. You only have to do the B.R.A.I.N.S technique session once on a particular event. So this is not something you have to do a bazillion times about a specific event. If you get into the root, if you get into that identifying that snapshot really effectively and efficiently, then you'll just have to do it once.
Does anybody else have any questions or anything they want to share before we wrap up the call tonight?
I will give a testimonial. I have taken Whitney's course last fall, right after Helene.
Oh.
Wonderful, wonderful. And I'm so happy to see you again this evening. Thank you, Zach, for coordinating this. Yes, but highly recommend working with Whitney. It's just remarkable what you've done. And I think that it is evolving. It sounds like there are some new things that you have added to the training. Yeah.
Yeah, the hurricane taught me a lot, and the fires.
Best of luck in DC.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. Imagine a world where we all have access to prevent PTSD for ourselves or support other people. Our
And
brain's
to
getting
prevent-
deeply wired in that PTSD reaction.
And to prevent illness. Like, we do not have to be an ill country. We can take care of ourselves. It is stress and trauma that turns a program on in the brain for us to get sick. If we can mitigate that when stress happens, it is the best prevention possible and is super fast and effective and efficient in preventing disease.
One other thing I mentioned before we get off, and Whitney and I have discussed the possibility of doing a research project with folks with how this can work with physical pain and support reducing physical pain. And we gave a couple examples tonight. National Medical Massage, most people come to see us because they're having pain issues. We're curious to use it in that setting to support our clients. We don't have any of the details worked out on how we would go about that yet. It's something we're both really interested in doing. If you're dealing with the physical pain and you're curious how this could help you with the pain, first I'd say I'd encourage you to purchase the course and start learning that way on your own. You could also let me know that you're interested, and we'll put you on a list to be the first to know when we decide to do a more focused little project together.
Yeah. In my ideal world, Zach and his team are so amazing in taking care of the physical structure. And this would take care of the mental, emotional structure that gets hijacked when you're in pain for a long period of time. We're wondering if using both of these tools together can actually help him get into the physical body more quickly and easily, to be able to speed that up as well. If there's people who are interested, we'll be sending out an email about that when we pull all that together.
Thank you, Whitney. And always enjoy our time together. And I'm glad other people got to be a part of it tonight. And thanks I had a nice rewiring of for myself from something recently, and that feels good. And I'll be paying attention the next 24 hours for new perspective and validation of that perspective as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you all for your attention and for turning on your videos when we were doing the group. It's challenging in a group to be able to make sure that somebody is tended to individually. If you have questions, please reach out to me. I can tell by your bright faces that everybody looks like they're feeling better.
It's brainstechnique.com/programs, where you can read more about both of the programs that she has right now.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Whitney, and thanks for everybody who came out tonight.
Thank you all. Have a good evening.